Einen wunderschönen guten Nachmittag. Danke vielmals, Herr Gouverneur, dass wir im kleinen Festsaal der Österreichischen Nationalbank unseren 30. Geburtstag vorfeiern und feiern dürfen. Ich darf auch sehr herzlich Professor Bruce Caldwell begrüßen, who is joining us online. Professor Klausinger zur linken Seite des Herrn Gouverneurs. Sehr geehrte Damen, sehr geehrte Herren, mein Name ist Barbara Kolm. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir heute hier die Geschichte Hayeks bzw. die ersten 50 Jahre mit Ihnen gemeinsam unter der Führung des Gouverneurs diskutieren dürfen. Einige administrative Dinge. Wir werden natürlich nachher gebührlich auf unseren Geburtstag anstoßen, haben aber auch für Sie alle eine kleine Broschüre vorbereitet, die Sie bitte, wenn Sie sie noch nicht genommen haben, mitnehmen und sich einmal so durchblättern, zurückerinnern, was schon alles in den letzten oder was wir alles in den letzten 30 Jahren erreicht haben. Ich würde sagen, vom kleinen Beginn vor 30 Jahren, ein Jahr nach Hayeks Ableben, hat sich das Institut mittlerweile entwickelt zu dem Hayek Institut im deutschsprachigen Raum, zum führenden Institut. Wir sind weltweit unter den Top-Instituten, unabhängigen Instituten gerankt, gemeinsam mit dem Austrian Economic Center auf Platz 21. Also das haben wir, glaube ich, ganz gut hingebracht. Ohne öffentliche Unterstützung, ohne Subventionen, ohne Steuergelder, sondern immer nur mit Unterstützung von Institutionen, Firmen, Spenden und ihrer Mitgliedschaft natürlich. Und ich glaube, das ist ganz wichtig, dass man in Zeiten wie diesen auch ganz klar diesen marktwirtschaftlichen, wettbewerblichen Charakter hochhalten, und wir werden das auch weiterhin tun. Unser Team ist bemüht, nicht nur das Thema Steuerwettbewerb hochzuhalten, sondern auch andere gesellschaftspolitische Themen, die uns vor allem in Österreich betreffen, zu diskutieren. Aber I would just say, I simply hand over to our governor. Thank you, dear Robert, for hosting us here. And we have an international audience here as well. Many of our friends who have been companion travelers over the past years, not only with the Free Market Roadshow, but with many other international events and institutions are here today. Thanks for joining us and for celebrating with us. It's an honor to have friends among like-minded people across the world. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Barbara. Have you changed over to English? Thought I may have mispresented my presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, liberal friends, it's a great pleasure and honor hosting you here, welcoming you here at the Austrian National Bank, because I think it's a perhaps unique event which is happening. The presentation of a book by Friedrich August von Hayek here at the Austrian National Bank. And thank you very much for the two authors joining us here. One is physically here. The other one is, and this is the beauty of modern technology, able to come in here. So we can save the world, no CO2. We still have the possibility for an interaction. I think it's not easy to put the relationship, the influence, the entanglement between the Austrian School of Economics and the Austrian Central Bank in concrete terms. However, I have to say, at least conceptually, both have been pretty close. Looking around, I don't think I have to explain the link which exists between the great names of the Austrian School of Economics, Karl Menger, Friedrich von Wieser, Schumpeter, August von Hayek, and others, because they have had the imprint on economic thinking, on monetary policy, monetary thinking, and so one should have expected there have been close interactions, and those are also closer to if and as one reads Hayek. However, I tried it, and it was difficult to find out, didn't succeed, to find out whether von Hayek has ever been in this building, the new one, which was finished in 25, or the old one then in the Austrian-Hungarian banker. And so we don't know whether he was here at all, whether he was giving a speech, whether he was participating or not, and or was it after the Second World War when he held a professorship in Salzburg, and even for that I was not able to find out whether he was ever invited here to give a speech, to talk about his research there. And maybe two gentlemen, one here on the screen and the other one here, may give an answer. And perhaps the answer doesn't exist yet, but perhaps it may come up in the second volume, when it will be out in a couple of years, that we will be able to answer this profound question, which somewhat moves us all. Was he here or wasn't he here? In any case, I'm here, and I'm happy, how to say, that this allowed me, this inconsequential position allowed me to propose, ever when I started to read this book, that we should have a book presentation. Because I was deeply intrigued by the book. I mean, I knew somewhat Hayek from before, but I don't know how many of you have read the book already. I hope many after this presentation. I was intrigued by the style of the book, the approach, and then by the content. Because it was not something where many books exist, whether what Hayek has been doing and what was his struggle with Keynes and others. It was this very profound background description, the background, the historical background, the personal background, the intellectual background, which comes through his life. And as I'm very much interested in history, ever since my school time, it was great to read the school background of the time when Hayek was around, to read when he was a soldier, to read his time at the LSE. This was highly illuminating, and I think this allowed me also to better understand the intellectual discussion, the outcome of Hayek and his discussion with Keynes, and also coming out, that there were not so much enemies. There were, how to say, people which tried, each of them, economists, particularly academic economists, are somewhat proud, and so they want to be better than the others. They want to win the argument, and so this background, including the chapter of explaining the LSE, the background of the individuals, what they were thinking, where they were coming from, what they were influenced. So this made it a great book. This is the reason why, how to say, I thought the book should be presented. Some of those who don't want to read too much, you get a short version. The others have perhaps a strong motivation to buy the book, to read it over Christmas, where I have to admit I have to read the last 35% or so, because despite all that, I could only read the first 2/3, and I'm looking forward to it. But before you get the pleasure of, how to say, examples of the book, let me introduce, if it is all necessary, both gentlemen who wrote the book. First, Professor Bruce Caldwell. He's a renowned economic historian with a specific focus on the life and work of Hayek. He's an author of numerous books. He wrote Hayek's Challenge, intellectual biography of Hayek. This was in 2004, and since 2002, he served as an editor for a collection of works of Hayek. And in 22, he published the Mount Bellarine 1947 background transcripts of the founding members and meetings of the Ballerine Society, as well as a 2-volume biography of Hayek, alive for 89 and 50, together with Professor Hansjörg Klausinger, etc., etc. He taught, of course, at highly respected universities, Stanford, New York, LSE, Cambridge, and now for some time he's at Duke University, also a well-noted university in the south of the US, where he's director of the Center of History and Political Economy. The second person we were particularly proud is an Austrian professor, Hansjörg Klausinger. He is also a strong focus on the Austrian School of Economics and Hayek. He, young man, retires so early nowadays. He is also retired, but he continues lecturing at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And he has done extensive research in economics, monetary policy, and economic history. And he's known for his well-founded analysis and advanced understanding of the Austrian School of Economics, including also then Hayek and the Vienna circles, and also about the great economist, the Größenökonomen Friedrich von Hayek. And then he wrote also an interesting book about the background of a club or an association which still exists today, which is the Oesterreichische Nationalbank Gesellschaft, Austrian Economic Association, which is still well alive and moving. And so two people who devoted their life to the Austrian school, to Hayek. And so with no further ado, I have now the question, to whom shall I pass on? First to you. So we have a first and a second, whatever is interaction between both two, and then we will have a discussion, I suppose, before we move to the second part, which Barbara will teach.
Thank you.
Professor Klausinger, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for the possibility to speak to you in this environment. I will speak about two issues. The first issue is Hayek's root in the Viennese intellectual milieu, and the second one is Hayek's battle with Keynes. Turning to the first one, Hayek was born as Friedrich Adler von Hayek, and as we all know, he lost the von in the First Republic, and when he became a British citizen in 1938, he regained it again. So he is, from that point on, known in the literature as von Hayek. Well, where does this von come? Adler means that he was born in a family of the lowest rank of the lower nobility. Other members of the Austrian school also belong to the lower nobility. We know that Wieser and Haberler were barons, and Mises and Striegel were knights. But being a member of the lower nobility does not mean that he was an aristocrat. Rather, these members of the lower nobility did not live in palaces with liveried servants, but Hayek's family lived in a rented flat in a Vienna district with a modest reputation, and they had a maid and a cook, which was just the typical environment of an upper middle class Vienna family. Much more interesting and much more crucial for Hayek's development was the intellectual environment in which he was born into. I often like to say that he was born into a family of professors, because his paternal grandfather had a chair on public law at the University of Vienna. His father had a lectureship on botany. He had two uncles with chairs at Vienna universities, one in meteorology and the other in German philology. And of course, both his brothers had also chairs at Austrian universities. Heinz was an anatomist, and Erich, the other brother, was a chemist. So a lot of intellectual stimulations around him. We know also that he was in his youth acquainted with at least 3 future Nobel Prize winners. One was Erwin Schrödinger, and the other 2 were Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch, and he just moved in the same circles like these future well-known scientists. The point which I want to emphasize is Hayek's emancipation from his family background. Later on in his life, he described the structure of the Vienna intellectual milieu by distinguishing between 3 groups of circles. The one was purely Christian, the other was purely Jewish, and they were in between mixed circles. And the point is that we have a lot of evidence in our book that Hayek's family belonged to the group which only moved in, so to say, Christian circles. Or let's say these were associations which were closed by a kind of Aryan paragraphs to outsiders. And the point is that from the start of his study at the University of Vienna, Hayek began to leave this closed environment and to move into so-called mixed circles. This began with his close friendship with Herbert Fürth, who was one of his only 3 close friends. Hayek's social life was to some extent very restricted. He had only very few people to which he was on 2 terms in Austrian, or which he called only by their surnames in his correspondence, and Herbert Fürth was one of them. And Herbert Fürth was of Jewish descent. And jointly with Fürth, he entered the Student Union, which characterized itself by an equal distance to all the 3 great Austrian political parties, so it covered only a very small niche. And jointly, again, with Herbert Fürth, he founded an intellectual circle, which was called the Geistkreis, with all male members and with a majority of Jewish members. So we can say that in the 1920s and for the rest of his life, he moved in so-called mixed groups or mixed circles. Another evidence is, of course, that he worked in an office under the supervision of Ludwig von Mises. Mises became his mentor, and Hayek also was soon admitted to the Mises private seminar. And again, the Mises private seminar was populated by a majority of Jewish members. The final point which I would like to make is Hayek's behavior after the Anschluss of Austria to the German Reich in 1938, and how he supported those people who afterwards in Austria were persecuted for racial or political reasons. We have again evidence that he wrote a lot of letters of recommendations to peoples who were in danger from the Geistkreis, from the Mises seminar, also from the Vienna Institute for Business Cycle Research, where Hayek had been a director for some years. And in particular, we see that he based his recommendations not on ideology, but merely on intellectual capacity. So we can give a few examples. For instance, from the Business Cycle Institute, he wrote letters of recommendations to 2 people where it was very evident that they were persecuted for their socialist leanings. Adolf Kotzlik, who later became deputy director of the IHS, and for Josef Steindl, a future member of the WIFO. And the final example I may give is that in the 1940s, the late 1940s, he wrote a letter of recommendation for Kurt Rothschild, who, for a position at the Austrian WIFO, at a time when it was widely known that Rothschild was very close to the Communist Party. So he never based his recommendations on the type of Weltanschauung, but only what he felt was the possibility to contribute to scientific progress on intellectual capacity. Well, that's the one point. The other issue which I want to take up is still more complicated, namely Hayek's business cycle theory and his battle with Keynes. Here I want to concentrate only on a few narrow points. How can we characterize Hayek's business cycle theory? It's a monetary theory. It's a theory with monetary causes of the cycle, but the cycle itself shows itself in changes in the real structure of the economy. So Hayek's idea is that that the cause of the business cycle is inflation or monetary expansion, and this monetary expansion is the cause of the boom, and during the boom, the structure of the economy or the structure of production will be changed in a way which is not sustainable in the long term. So in Hayek's view, the crisis comes about through the necessity of readjust the economy from the malinvestments in the boom to a structure which is again sustainable in the long term. So what he gives us is a kind of structural theory of the business cycle. And we should note that at the time, there were two very, very interesting points of this theory of the business cycle. It was one of the very few instances where it succeeded in integrating monetary theory in a kind of general economic theory. These were no longer two separate compartments of theory, but what Hayek tried is to give a universal theory of a monetary capital-using economy. The second point, that to some extent his business cycle theory also anticipates what he says about the knowledge problem. The superiority of the market economy consists in that it is able, by using the price mechanism, to direct the use of resources by price signals. And what he shows in his business cycle theory, that if there are problems with monetary stability, then price signals may come into existence which mislead the economy. So it is also a kind of integration of what later became his knowledge problem with the business cycle theory. On the other hand, why did Hayek's business cycle theory not succeed in the 1930s? Well, my answer is perhaps not the one that all adherents of Hayek would expect. My answer is that to some extent, it did not fit the empirical facts. The point is, my answer is, there are structural causes of crisis, but there are also types of crisis which much more correspond to what Keynes had described as the cause of the crisis. They're simple, a lack of aggregate demand. And there may be different causes, and there may be different crises with different causes which need different remedies. And it may even be the case in the Great Depression that something that started as a structural crisis may degenerate in a crisis with a lack of aggregate demand. In the contemporary discussion, this was described as the opposition between primary and secondary aspects, or primary or secondary phases of a depression. In the primary phase of a depression, there is a structural misadjustment which must be remedied, and here Hayek's policy prescriptions would apply. The policy description would be simply to let the price mechanism work and to abstain as much as possible from interference through monetary and fiscal policies. But such crises might degenerate into what is called a secondary depression. And in the secondary depression, there's simply also a lack of aggregate demand. And in such a secondary depression, Keynesian remedies will work. But of course, what we should take as a lesson from this distinction is that different crises might need different remedies, and that in particular, in the aftermath of the Keynesian revolution, we should be aware of that not all crises can be remedied by using Keynesian recipes. You will all know the American saying, for someone who has only a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. This is not the case. You will not be able to remedy all crisis and depressions by Keynesian measures. But why did Keynesian remedies apply in the Great Depression? Well, we all know from the investigations by Friedman and Schwartz that during the Great Depression, the quantity of money measured as we would measure it today decreased or shrank by approximately, my memory is correct, 30%. And of course, a shrinkage of money by 30% must create something like a lack of aggregate demand. And at the time, in the 1930s, Hayek was, let us say, agnostic with regard to the problem of deflation. In some instances, he even opposed measures which would have halted this deflation. But in the 1970s, he eventually changed his mind, or eventually he stated what he found to be correct. And he said, in a kind of deep depression, he would advise the central bank to do all that is possible to prevent a deflation of the money supply. And from this advice, if we look back in the 1930s and know that the money supply then shrank by 30%, we must draw the conclusion that this was a failure of monetary policy, and this failure of monetary policy could have been remedied by some kind of Keynesian measures. Let us remind that Keynes was not primarily interested in fiscal policy. Keynes was a monetary theorist, and most of the time his policies were meant to be monetary policies, not fiscal policies. Well, two more short points I'd like to make. Why did Keynes win over Hayek? Well, not only because the Great Depression was, so to say, the special case where once in a time Keynesian remedies were called for, but also because, Keynes' rhetoric was superior, if not even ruthless to some extent. The ideological climate of the 1930s was in favor of planning, and so Keynes's advice was much more into the picture than Hayek's. And to some extent, we may also say that also Keynes was not very favorable of it. The Keynesian model lent itself much more easily to econometrics than the Hayekian one. So there was a kind of alliance of the Keynesian revolution with what others have since termed the formalist revolution in economics. But finally, I want to make a point on the more general similarities or differences between Hayek and Keynes. Well, we may find a similarity in that both tried in the 1930s to save capitalism. So to some extent, by very different measures. But to some extent, we may say both were liberals, but of course, very liberals of a very different type. And one of the differences we may see, that after Hayek had written his Road to Serfdom, Keynes wrote him a letter which heaped a lot of praise on Hayek. He was very fascinated with the Road of Serfdom. And I think the only major criticism by Keynes was that he said that Hayek set the limits for planning for freedom or the limits for government measures, government interventions into the economy too narrow. The limit that Hayek had set was it is only the task of the government or of the state to set a legal framework of general and abstract rules. While Keynes insisted that discretion or measures based on expediency would also be permissible in the case you could trust the government to be wise and beneficial. And the point is perhaps that Hayek's experiences with Austrian politics, and in particular with the hyperinflation of the 1920s, led him to quite another position on this issue. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
So as you can see, obviously not much has changed, at least with regards to governments and to the wisdom of politicians. And I know that our governor would like to add at least a couple of sentences to what has been mentioned already. But I would like to ask Professor Caldwell first to give us his a short presentation, and for those who are not convinced enough by now that you should read the 500 pages book, you will for sure be after Professor Caldwell's presentation. Over to you, Bruce.
Hi, Barbara. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person, and thank you so much for making it possible for me to attend remotely. Honesty in advertising, the book is actually more than 500 pages, but I won't tell you exactly how much more than 500, so as to not put people off from buying it. Well, I'll pick up the story where Hansjörg left off. He mentioned the conflict with Keynes, and this occurred soon after Hayek arrived at the London School of Economics in the early 1930s. But very quickly, Hayek turned his attention away from Keynes to another problem. So the early 1930s, this is the middle of the Great Depression, really at perhaps the lowest point in terms of national statistics. And the London School of Economics had been founded in 1895 by Fabian socialists, Sidney and Beatrice Webb and others. So there were a number of socialists on the faculty. And what Hayek realized was that the general theme of the British intelligentsia in response to the Great Depression in the, if we want to call it that, Western democracies or more capitalist countries, that it seemed like capitalism had completely failed, just as the Marxists had said it would. But if you look at the continent and you see the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union was not very attractive. You have fascism in various countries. You have National Socialism starting to come on. None of these seem to be viable alternatives to capitalism from the perspective of the British intelligentsia. So their enthusiasm was all for socialism. Lionel Robbins, Hayek's great friend at the London School of Economics, said, yes, socialism is the grand panacea. Planning is the grand panacea. Who could be opposed to planning? This is the right way forward. And this was the set of arguments that Hayek thought that he should try to address. His initial approach was to offer a small book that collectivist economic planning. It included his two essays, one as a prologue and the other as an epilogue to the book that he wrote himself. But then the rest of the essays were translations of discussions about socialism that had taken place on the continent, where in the German language, if you will, socialist calculation debate. So he's alerting his British colleagues to the arguments against socialism that had already been made. These were academic arguments. And indeed, they were very important for Hayek in terms of developing some of the ideas that he would later enunciate concerning the knowledge problem, talking about how a well-functioning market system enables coordinated action in a world of dispersed knowledge, some of which is wrong. Okay, the idea that a market system in its signals, price signals, reflect relative scarcities. I say well-functioning because, as Hansjörg noted, if the monetary arrangements are not working well, that these price signals will also not work well. And if there's price fixing, that prevents price, and many policies obviously involve price fixing. The monetary signals will not be working well. But in a well-functioning price system, you're able to coordinate action in a world of dispersed knowledge, and errors get corrected very quickly, or certainly more quickly than they would in a system where you didn't have private property and the means of production. So these debates among the academic socialists and Hayek were very important in terms of the theoretical developments, but he started to worry about the more popular enthusiasm for socialism that was everywhere rife in England and other places in the 30s. There were a number of different people who were engaged in this, and we go into some detail as to the personnel. But there was a specific group that he was very worried about, and he called them the men of science. He called them that because that was what they called themselves, indeed. And these are natural scientists who would be talking about how, if we had a planned society, science could be allowed to flourish in a way that it wasn't under capitalism, and science would enable various countries to solve the various problems that were facing them in terms of the unemployment problem, and also just producing, get rid of scarcity. Essentially, was the promise. You'd be able to produce so much more if we just had government control that gave better support to scientific research. And so Hayek's, being Hayek, he didn't try to write a popular book right away. His initial response was to have a massive two-volume work, Abuse and Decline of Reason Project was the way that we label it. And he started on this at the end of, just as the world was starting to turn towards war in the late 1930s. This was a time when he, as Hansjörg pointed out, people like Keynes and Hayek were very much on the same side because their opponents were taking much more radical positions. So he started on this big book, got some of it done. The LSE was evacuated to Cambridge, where Keynes found Hayek rooms at King's College. So they continued their relationship there. And he soon realized that perhaps a big two-volume work was not going to be the right approach to trying to convince people in terms of these more popular views. So this is where he decided that instead of the big book, he would write a small, more popular pamphlet, The Road to Serfdom. It was published in England in 1944, early 1944, a little later in the United States. And it sold well, but it probably would have been a forgotten book, except that in the United States, a small magazine called the Reader's Digest that takes books that are popular books of the day and condenses them. So the Road to Serfdom, which is not a big book, was then reduced to 20 pages. And something like 10 million copies of this were distributed. Book of the Month Club, another organization in the United States, picked up distribution of it. We really had fun reporting on this part of it. Hayek was going over to the United States to appear at 5 or 6 university campuses to talk about the book. And the Road to Serfdom Reader's Digest condensation comes out while he's in transit. He arrives in New York City, and a very American thing happened. It was turned over to a publicity company, and he had a 6-week whirlwind tour. He was sometimes talking twice a day. He would then get on a night train, sleep, get up the next morning, and do it again. I mean, it was ridiculous, really. I couldn't imagine doing something like that. He would have been in the mid-40s, so I guess I could imagine a younger man being able to do that, but I certainly couldn't imagine doing it now. Anyway, this book gave him his 15 minutes of fame, as it were, really made his name well known. It was much better received by conservatives than it was by liberals, who the argument of the book is to promote liberalism, but the conservatives were the ones who really liked it the most. And its most important aspect, though, I think, is that it, besides getting him better known, he became on one of his talks, he met the person who was in charge of the Volcker Fund. This is an American foundation. His name was Harold Lunau, and this was a person who ultimately helped finance the next big initiative that Hayek had, which was to found the Mont Pelerin Society. The founding meeting was in 1947. It took place in Switzerland. Wilhelm Röpke had been in touch with a man in a Swiss gentleman, Hunold, who managed to secure funding for the meeting. And Lunau, the American, was able to fund a number of the visitors who came from America to that initial meeting. So Hayek was worried about the fate of liberalism after the war. Those who can remember the history that we go through in some detail, it was a very dire time if one was a liberal and had a hope for renewing liberalism in the 20th century. So he brought together people that he had met on his various speaking tours, and it was a wonderful collection of people. It's absolutely amazing group of people if one thinks of economics in the 20th century and the participants. So in addition to Lionel Robbins and Stanley Denison and a man named Jukes from the United Kingdom, he had his friends from Vienna. So this included Fritz Machlup and Ludwig von Mises. He had Ordo liberals, Walter Eucken, Wilhelm Röpke were both in attendance. He had various members of what we now identify as the Chicago School. So Frank Knight, who was the original Chicago School founder, and he had as students in the 1930s, George Stigler, Aaron Director, and Milton Friedman. All of them were also attending. We have a wonderful photograph of some of the people at that meeting where Milton Friedman is there and 34 years old. I mean, it's a wonderful picture. There were, in addition to economists, other sorts of people. Hayek's great friend Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, as well as Michael Polanyi were in attendance. There were newspaper people. Henry Hazlitt was a famous American newspaperman who had written the review of the Road to Serfdom for the New York Times. And then there were various foundation people. The Foundation of Economic Education had been set up in New York in 1946, the year before. So there were some of those people in attendance. So it was a fundamentally important meeting, because what Hayek's goal was to say, look, if we're serious about trying to advance liberalism, we got to figure out how we're going to do it. And he said his solution was not to try to engage publicly in writing position papers that would be widely available to the public, but rather to investigate the philosophical foundations of a liberal order. And that was his mission, his goal. His first 5 sessions, this was one of the books that Governor Holzmann mentioned. I did the transcripts of that first meeting, provided an introduction to it, and then provided it was not a verbatim transcript, but a rough idea of what was discussed in the various sessions. There were 10 overall topics. The 5 in the first week were ones that Hayek himself had proposed. And they really, got at some of the burning issues of the day. And what was so much what's so interesting in doing that transcript volume is that, of course, these issues are still live issues today. So one of them, the very first one, had to do with free enterprise or the competitive order. So free enterprise would be much less government intervention, presumably, kind of a Misesian approach, versus an ordoliberal approach might be the competitive order. That was the very first session, very lively session, I can assure you, just as it would be today if people were debating these issues. The second one was on history. And I don't know what it's like in Austria, but certainly in the United States, the historian's treatment of neoliberalism is something that gets a lot of attention. And often this 1947 meeting is viewed as the place that neoliberalism got its start. So lots of contention about that. Well, Hayek recognized how important history was to the telling of the tale of various ideological views. The problem of Germany was the third session. The fourth session was about the question of federation. Obviously, quite another important issue. And the final one, which was chaired by Frank Knight, who was famously atheistic, was on liberalism and religion, liberalism and Christianity. So these were lively sessions. Lots of disagreement among these people who, in one way, shared many views in common, but certainly disagreed on the details. Hayek complained that there were too many economists at the meeting. And indeed, when he turned over the last 5 sessions to the people there, 4 of the 5 were on economics issues. So the second week was devoted to economics topics. The final one was on the current problems, and it had to do with what do we do about Russia. So reading the 1947 transcripts is insightful to the times that Hayek was living. I think sheds a lot of light on today. So I'll stop here. I talked only about the intellectual issues. Obviously, the book also talked about various personal issues that took place during this time period as well. But again, thank you so much for allowing me to visit you remotely.
Thank you much for taking the time, particularly the evening, for being with us. And again, congrats to both of you for writing the book. In addition to what you have said, I would like to add some of my comments reading the book and what I heard now to get perhaps you more even intrigued to read the book which is out there. And these are not now in a great logical order. It's more comments which come through it. What I learned from the book I didn't know before is that Hayek's English was pretty bad when he came to the UK. And so people mused, they didn't know whether he spoke English or German when he spoke. My take is this may have been one of the reasons, beside his more calm way of interacting, why he was not so convincing. Because if you are not intrusive, getting up and saying, I know this, and then, but more soft-spoken, and then you speak in something which not easily understandable, you have no chance for somebody who is brought up in an English university where you have debating clubs where, how to say, you know how to win the argument there. I think this is one of the reasons why he had difficulties. But I think it's also true that he focused on something which until now has not become a major part of the explanation why economics doesn't work so well. He was very much focused on the supply side, and the supply also how capital reacts to prices and how this reaction depending now when you make the investment, what the amortization is. He got involved into this in the pure theory of capital. But here his other problem was that he was a big picture person. He was not a person of mathematics. And in order to solve this problem, doing verbal plus graphics wasn't sufficient to come forward with the solution. Now, the good thing is, you must have noticed that the moments we started back again to the big picture. And this is where I think he was intrigued for a long time as the role of prices comes through. So really, well, this is something which characterizes the Austrian school in general, but him in particular, that knowledge is important, and prices as a way, or price system as a way how information can be passed on. This hit him very much, so he moved away, and his capital theory, which he ended, I think it was a torture for everybody who was involved, at least I got from what you wrote about it. I never read it, so I'm only talking about something I don't know, but must have been difficult for everybody who was involved. But once he dropped it, then how to say, I think he was free, and then how to say, it allowed him to move to other areas. Another thing which I think is important, how much Hayek was interested in getting Europe up again. So he was a deeply convinced European, and as a result of it, at the end of the war, he immediately tried everything in order to get the European youth together. And I think many of you will know it, but he was highly instrumental to create Alpbach. So already in 45, the war was hardly over, and he had his great connections to American foundations. He went to them, backed them, and which got some money together to bring the youngsters together, and had them sit around, like in Greek times, in a fruit tree, in order to discuss topics there. They even tried nowadays, but unfortunately, it's less about Hayek and others. It's more about, social planning and others. Now, I had a number of nice discussions with my, sparring partner, Joe Stiglitz, in Hayek, on Hayek, that unfortunately, the idea to have a discussion about other topics has not yet found foundations in as much as it should be. The only thing is that at least what they have done now for the last couple of years, and Austrian National Bank helped to co-sponsor, they have a lot of use there, which comes there, interacts. The problem I have now, and I think many of us will have, is they stay with themselves, and they hardly interact with the not so young anymore, like many of us. And so it required special tricks to bring them to the table. And what we did is that in the panel, the governance panel, that I organized now the second time, is that we invite them to comment on our panel, and also to get invited to the lunch or dinner. And then there's the possibility to hear them out, what the listen is, and then to try to get the best argument out, that to make them understand that what they heard in the morning from Joe is perhaps not the end of the letter. There are different truths still to be heard. And my argument is, I think this kind of intellectual meetings are very important, but unfortunately not so much used by us in order to get some of the different messages across. I think with this, I end now my intervention, my additional thoughts. There may be many more others there, and I hand back to Barbara.
Well, thank you, Governor. Professor Holzmann, please do.
Well, I just may note that in my investigations of the 1960s, I realized that in the transition from President Kamitz to President Schmitz, there was a time when the Austrian government, this was the government led by Bundeskanzler Klaus, for some time considered if not Fritz Machlup could be one of the successors of Kamitz. And then for a very short time, they also considered Hayek. I think Hayek had a meeting with the Chancellor, and I think afterwards he was no longer considered a candidate. But there was there was a very short time when Hayek could have become president of the Austrian National Bank. It was very short.
But at least it was worth a try. Then I would like to thank Professor Caldwell, who I know will have to run to one of his classes right away and will not be able to toast with us on Hayek's birthday, but hopefully virtually, or at least in mind. And when you are preparing the next big volume for the next 47 years of Hayek's life. And since you mentioned Hayek's relevance, I mean, his relevance also as a social philosopher and his concept and his view of a free and responsible society, I think, is more relevant than ever these days. So I think we can look forward to what the two gentlemen will have to will write down in the next couple of years, and probably at the 40th anniversary of the. Hopefully, at the 40th anniversary of the Hayek Institute, we will be able to present the next big volume. Can
we have a publication date?
No pressures, no pressures. And I would also like to thank, first of all, our board members, especially those who are here, Dr. Zundrich, Dr. Stix, and Dr. Vetter, for having been with the Hayek Institute, have stood up and have defended all our values and the work of Hayek, especially over the past years, and for all the the big help over the past, at least from my side, I can say 23 years. Then to those who are not a member yet of the Hayek Institute, feel free to join. There are application forms in this brochure, and of course there are other Christmas presents that you could pick up for friends and family. I assume you all have read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the German edition. We do, of course, have the English edition at our institute as well. But you may buy that and give those presents to those who need to be convinced. And then, of course, there is this great volume that is being presented here that we have just discussed. Thank you again, Professor Klausinger and Professor Caldwell, for taking the time. Thank you, Governor Holzmann, for hosting us here and for allowing us to do this little celebration. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should toast outside to Hayek, to the great work that he did, and to the birthday of the Institute. Thanks a lot.